Hey y'all, thank you so much for stopping by our channel. My name is Alicia Cooper, one half of the Divorce Proof Marriage Coaching platform. My husband and I started the platform to teach people the skills they need to help divorce proof their relationships because we think marriage is important to society. This video is going to be a little different than maybe most of the videos that we will be posting to our channel because I was watching a video by Crimson Cure. Shout out to Crimson Cure. She posted a video on January 3rd. Today is the 9th of January, 2022. And Crimson Cure, shout out again to her, posted a video entitled, "This is Why Black Women Are a Lost Cause." And in that video, Kendra talked about what the lost cause doctrine is or school of thought is, how it came to be, um, how and why it began, and how our communities have been ravaged by this doctrine and still don't know how that even came to be. She was just given a historical context about what the lost cause, I'll call it doctrine, is and how it's affecting us. And I had never heard of the lost cause doctrine, so it's very intriguing to me. And I did some more digging into what she was talking about, and then that put me down a rabbit hole into something else that I had seen. Erica Williams of the Classic Climb blog, shout out to her. She had posted an article to her community wall on YouTube back in November. And hopefully you can see this. But this article talks about, this is from either the 1920s or the 30s. And as you can see there, it's the title is "Negro Women Who Quit Jobs Warned by the Mayor of This Town." This is in Alexandria, Louisiana. And unfortunately, I didn't get the entire article, the screenshot of the entire article, but I'll just briefly read to you about what the article is about so you can get some context. It says the Mayor W. George Bowden, revised customary work or fight order and said that unless Negro women stop deliberately leaving jobs without cause, he's going to fight or run them out of town personally. Mayor Bowden said that he is receiving complaints that Negro women employed by housewives, cafes, and other business establishments and receiving much higher salaries than they ever did before are leaving their jobs. And that's where kind of the article cut off. But I read the whole article before, and it just talks about how the men were returning back from the war. And so the Negro women, as we were called back in the day, Black women, were leaving their jobs because they wanted to take care of their own children. Back then, Black women could pretty much only work as domestics. So they, again, it's natural to want to care for your child. That's what they were trying to do. But as you can see here in the 20s or 30s, this particular town had an actual law in place that forced the women to work or they would be fined. I can't recall what else would happen, but essentially they were forcing the women to return to work and not care for their own children. So just put a pin in that. So the other thing that happened this past summer is I was reading this particular book. I saw this author being interviewed, and it was so intriguing to me. I apologize. This is my first time using StreamYard, so I apologize, I didn't have my window ready. So this book, Subverted, the author is Sue Ellen Browder. And I have this book here. It's a very interesting book, but there were some interesting tidbits, shall we say, that intrigued me, that caused me to do more research. I forgot to say that the point this video is about whether or not we were programmed as Black women to actually not want to be married and care for our children, but rather work in the economy versus our homes. Were we programmed to think that way versus it being a natural occurrence? And I'm thinking, once you hear about all these pieces being put together, you might start thinking, like I'm thinking, and maybe we were programmed to think this way since some of these things have been going on since the turn of the century, actually. So, anyway, back to the book. As you can see on the screen there, it's called Subverted: How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. And so I'm just going to read a little bit from the inside sleeve of the book. And it says, in the book, the author, for the first time, talks about how it happened in her own life and in the entire country. Browder unwittingly betrayed her true calling and became a propagandist for sexual liberation. As a staff writer for Cosmopolitan magazine, she wrote pieces meant to soft sell unmarried sex, contraception, and abortion as the single woman's path to personal fulfillment. She did not realize until much later that propagandists, higher and more clever, she actually said cleverer, I'm saying more clever than herself, were influencing her thinking and her personal choices as they subverted the women's movement. The thirst for truth, integrity, and justice for women that led Browder into journalism in the first place eventually led her to find forgiveness and freedom in the place she least expected to find them. Her in depth research, her probing analysis, and her honest self reflection set the record straight and illumine a way forward for others who have suffered from the unholy alliance between the women's movement and the sexual revolution. So I read that, what the book was about on Amazon, ordered the book. And for the most part, it's pretty good. But there was some troubling things that I felt were troubling anyway. That kind of didn't jive with history. So I'm going to point a couple of those things out. So this is on page 12 of the book, and she talks about let's see, where did it go? She talks about a founder of the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, later called the National Abortion Rights Action League, and still later NARAL, Pro-Choice America. And she says that it was led by a man whose last name is Later. So I cannot find, oh, Larry Later, there it is. She said he was a master propagandist skilled in the manipulation of public opinion. So that's how she described Larry Later. As Margaret Sanger's biographer and a fervent population planner, Later himself said that the idea of legalizing abortion struck at the tenets of the Roman Catholic Church and fundamentalist faiths, but even more important, as the whole system of sexual morality to which the middle class gave lip service. So that's kind of all I wanted to read out of that. But the point of that, me reading this part, was that she says that Larry Later was Margaret Sanger's biographer and a fervent population planner. So put a pin in that. Then we go to page 38 of the book. She says, at Cosmo, this is the author talking about herself now. She said, at Cosmo magazine, I was a dedicated follower of Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, the foremost proponent of birth control as a panacea to the world's problems. Sanger idolized sex without kids. Through sex, Sanger sang joyously in the pivot of civilization, mankind may attain the great spiritual illumination which will transform the world, which will light up the only path to an earthly paradise. Sanger dreamed of that dawn when sex would be freed from all chains and men and women would at last realize that here, close at hand, is our paradise, our everlasting abode, our heaven, and our eternity. Not for woman only, but for all of humanity is this the field where we must seek the secret of eternal life? It's hard to deny that Sanger idolized sex as her god. At Cosmo, I danced in Sanger's procession. So that kind of made the hair on my neck stand up a little bit because she is describing Margaret Sanger in kind of a positive light. And if you know anything about her history, you know that she was a eugenicist, and she described Black people as weeds that needed to be exterminated. So I was like, I kept reading though. So let's continue. On page 54 of the book, she again talks about Larry Lader and Margaret Sanger's relationship. She says, the author, later claimed Margaret Sanger invented the control your own body slogan. But if she did not mean it. She did not mean by it what Lader said it meant. Sanger so vehemently opposed abortion that by Lader's own admission, his abortion advocacy caused a rift between them, which remained unhealed at her death. The author goes on to say, Sanger called abortion barbaric. It wasn't until after Sanger died and abortionist Alan Guttmacher took the helm that Planned Parenthood, the organization Sanger founded, publicly began to advocate legalized abortion. Dismissing Sanger as behind the times, Later created his own lexicon in which a woman's freedom to own and control her own body meant her right to unrestricted abortion on demand. So this was really alarming because she is attempting here to completely remove any guilt from Margaret Sanger in the whole abortion issue and put the blame on Larry Lader. And I'm like, does she not know about Margaret Sanger's history? So that led me to find this article here. Hopefully you can see that. It says this article is on EPI.org's website. And the title is Black Women's Labor Market History Reveals Deep-Seated Race and Gender Discrimination. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I'm going to get to that next. Excuse me. Let's go here next. So we're going to go to this article specifically about Margaret Sanger. So I just read to you from the book how the author tried to say that abortion was, Margaret Sanger did not mean control your own body. By it, what Lader said it meant. Again, just want to reread that. Sanger so vehemently opposed abortion that by Lader's own admission, his abortion advocacy caused a rift between them, which remained unhealed at her death. The author again says Sanger called abortion barbaric. So here's an article about Margaret Sanger's eugenic plan for Black Americans. This was reported in 2001. It was called the Negro Project. And I'm going to read most of it because, again, it's, I think, very helpful in the historical context of what I find to be, as Kendra pointed out, the attempt to retell history to get a desired end to perhaps cause population control. So here we go. On a crisp, sunny fall Columbus Day in 1999, organizers at the Say So March approached the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court. Blah, blah, blah. That's not important. Civil rights doesn't mean anything without a right to life, declared Hunter. He and the other marchers were protesting the disproportionately high number of abortions in the Black community. The high number is no accident. Many Americans, Black and white, are unaware of Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger's Negro Project. Sanger created this program in 1939 after the organization changed its name from the American Birth Control League to the Birth Control Federation of America. The aim of the program was to restrict, many believe exterminate, the Black population. Under the pretense of better health and family planning, Sanger cleverly implemented her plan. What's more shocking is Sanger's beguilement of Black America's creme de la creme, those prominent, well-educated, and well-to-do, into executing her scheme. So it's saying that she enticed the leaders of the Black community into helping her abort Black babies. Some within the Black elite saw birth control as a means to attain economic empowerment, elevate the race, and garner the respect of whites. The Negro Project has had lasting repercussions in the Black community. We have become victims of genocide by our own hands, cried Hunter at the Say So March. Malthusian eugenics, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that name. I don't know if it's Malthusian or Malthusian. I'm thinking it's Malthusian. Anyway, Margaret Sanger aligned herself with the eugenicists whose ideology prevailed in the early 20th century. Eugenicists strongly espoused racial supremacy and purity, particularly of the Aryan race. Eugenicists hoped to purify the bloodlines and improve the race by encouraging the fit to reproduce and the unfit to restrict their reproduction. They sought to contain the inferior races through segregation, sterilization, birth control, and abortion. Sanger embraced Malthusian eugenics. Thomas Robert Malthus, a 19th century cleric and professor of political economy, believed a population time bomb threatened the existence of the human race. He viewed social problems such as poverty, deprivation, and hunger as evidence of his population crisis. According to writer George Grant, Malthus condemned charities and other forms of benevolence because he believed they only exacerbated the problems. His answer was to restrict the population growth of certain groups of people. His theories of population growth and even economic stability became the basis for national and international social policy. Grant quotes from Malthus's magnum opus, an essay on the principles of population, published in 6 editions from 1798 to 1826. I believe this time period overlaps what Kendra talks about in her video regarding the Reconstruction era and the beginning of the Lost Cause doctrine. I'm pretty sure that overlaps that timeline. So it continues. All children born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish unless room is made for them by the deaths of grown persons. We should facilitate instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede the operations of nature in producing the mortality. Malthus's disciples believed if Western civilization were to survive, the physically unfit, the materially poor, the spiritually diseased, the racially inferior, and the mentally incompetent had to be suppressed and isolated or even perhaps eliminated. His disciples felt the subtler, probably should have been more subtle, and more scientific approaches of education, contraception, sterilization, and abortion were more practical and acceptable ways to ease the pressures of the alleged overpopulation. Critics of the Malthusianism said the group produced a new vocabulary of mumbo jumbo. It was all hard-headed, scientific, and relentless. Further, historical facts have proved the Malthusian mathematical scheme regarding overpopulation to be inaccurate, though many still believe them. Again, this was published in 2001. And I would say, as we've seen in recent history with wealthy people around the globe, people do still believe that the world is going to be overpopulated. But I digress. Continues. Despite the falsehood of Malthus's overpopulation claims, Sanger nonetheless immersed herself in Malthusian eugenics. Grant wrote she argued for birth control using the scientifically verified threat of poverty, sickness, racial tension, and overpopulation as its background. Sanger's publication, The Birth Control Review, founded in 1917, regularly published pro-eugenic articles from eugenicists such as Ernst Rudin. Although Sanger ceased editing the Birth Control Review in 1929, the ABCL continued to use it as a platform for eugenic ideas. Sanger built the work of the ABCL and ultimately Planned Parenthood. So we see it actually ties in Sanger building Planned Parenthood based on her eugenics background. She ultimately built Planned Parenthood on the ideas and resources of the eugenics movement. Grant reported that virtually all of the organization's board members were eugenicists. Eugenicists financed the early projects, from the opening of birth control clinics to the publishing of revolutionary literature. Eugenicists comprised the speakers at conferences, authors of literature, and the providers of services almost without exception. And Planned Parenthood's international work was originally housed in the offices of the Eugenics Society. The two organizations were intertwined for years. The ABCL became a legal entity in 1922 in New York. Before that, Sanger illegally operated a birth control clinic in October 1916 in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, New York, which eventually closed. The clinic serviced the poor immigrants who heavily populated the area, those deemed unfit to reproduce. Sanger's early writings clearly reflect Malthus's influence. She writes, organized charity itself is the symptom of a malignant social disease. Those vast, complex, interrelated organizations aiming to control and to diminish the spread of misery and destitution and all the menacing evils that spring out of this sinisterly fertile soil are the surest sign that our civilization is breeding and perpetuating constantly increasing numbers of defectives, delinquents, and dependents. So she said that charities are the problem in the world, and charities are helping to promote increasing numbers of defective people, delinquent people, and dependent people, people dependent upon society. In another passage, she decries the burden of human waste on society. It, meaning charity, encourages the healthier and more normal sections of the world to shoulder the burden of unthinking and indiscriminate fecundity. Excuse me, my mouth is not working properly. Fecundity, I think, of others, which brings with it, as I think the reader must agree, a dead weight of human waste. Instead of decreasing and aiming to eliminate the stocks that are most detrimental to the future of the race and the world, it tends to render them to a menacing degree dominant. She concluded, the most serious charge that can be brought against modern benevolence is that it encourages the perpetuation of defectives, delinquents, and dependents. These are the most dangerous elements in the world community, the most devastating curse on human progress and expression. The review printed an excerpt of an address that Sanger gave in 1926. In it, she said, it now remains for the U.S. government to set a sensible example to the world by offering a bonus or yearly pension to all obviously unfit parents who allow themselves to be sterilized by harmless and scientific means. In this way, the moron and the diseased would have no posterity to inherit their unhappy condition. The number of the feeble-minded would decrease and a heavy burden would be lifted from the shoulders of the fit. So she's advocating for government-funded abortion for people she deems unfit to live. And this is in 1926. So let's go on. I was trying not to read the entire article, but I wanted to give you context, which kind of disputes what she said about abortion essentially not being Margaret Sanger's idea. In fact, she was a cheerleader of abortion for, again, the group she deemed unfit. So let's go on. Margaret Sanger argued that birth control clinics or bureaus should be established in which men and women will be taught the science of parenthood and the science of breeding. For this was the way to breed out of the race, the scourges of transmissible disease, mental defect, poverty, lawlessness, crime, since these classes would be decreasing in number instead of breeding like weeds. So that's where the reference of comparing human beings to weeds came from. Her program called for women to receive birth control advice in various situations, including where the woman or man had a transmissible disease such as insanity, feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, syphilis, etc. The children already born were subnormal, whatever that means, or feeble-minded. the father's wages were inadequate to provide for more children. So again, let's recap that just for a minute. She's saying that she believes it was important to use birth control in the form of abortion in instances where the father's wages were inadequate in her mind to care for the children. Sanger said such a plan would reduce the birth rate among the diseased, the sickly, the poverty-stricken, and antisocial classes, elements unable to provide for themselves, and the burden of which we are all forced to carry. Sanger had openly embraced Malthusian eugenics, and it shaped her actions in the ensuing years. And this is about the Harlem Clinic. In 1929, 10 years before Sanger created the Negro Project, the ABCL laid the groundwork for a clinic in Harlem, a largely Black section of New York City. It was the dawn of the Great Depression, and for Blacks, that meant double the misery. Blacks faced harsher conditions of desperation and privation because of widespread racial prejudice and discrimination. From the ABCL's perspective, Harlem was the ideal place for the experimental clinic, which officially opened in November of 1930. Many Blacks looked to escape their adverse circumstances and therefore did not recognize the eugenic undercurrent of the clinic. All right. The clinic relied on the generosity of private foundations to remain in business. In addition to being thought of as an inferior and disproportionately represented in the underclass, according to the clinic's own files used to justify its work, Blacks in Harlem were segregated in an overpopulated area, and you can read the statistics there. Blacks comprised 12% of New York City's population, but accounted for 18.4% of New York City's unemployment, had an infant mortality rate of 101 per 1,000 births compared to 56 among whites, so double the infant mortality rate of white women. Blacks had a death rate from tuberculosis of 237 per 100,000. That was highest in Central Harlem out of all of New York City. So in the worst hit area in Harlem came the Savior Clinic to help relieve the poor people of the burdens of their unborn children. Although the clinic served whites as well as Blacks, it was established for the benefit of colored people. Sanger wrote this in a letter to W.E.B. Burghardt Du Bois. Some people say Du Bois, but it's Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the day's most influential Blacks. A sociologist and author, he helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909 to improve the living conditions of Black Americans. So again, Sanger wrote a letter. She wrote about the benefit of her clinic in a letter to W.E.B. Du Bois, who helped found the NAACP in 1909. Keep that in mind. That Blacks endured extreme prejudice and discrimination, which contributed greatly to their plight, seemed to further justify restricting their numbers. Many believe the solution lay in reducing reproduction. Sanger suggested the answer to poverty and degradation lay in smaller numbers of Blacks. She convinced Black civic groups in Harlem of the benefits of birth control under the cloak of better health, i.e., reduction of maternal and infant death, child spacing, and family planning. So with their cooperation and the endorsement of the Amsterdam News, a prominent Black newspaper, Sanger established the Harlem branch of the Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau. The ABCL told the community birth control was the answer to their predicament. Sanger shrewdly used the influence of prominent Blacks to reach the masses with this message. She invited Du Bois and a host of Harlem's leading Blacks, including physicians, social workers, ministers, and journalists, to form an advisory council to help direct the clinic so that our work in birth control will be a constructive force in the community. She knew the importance of having Black professionals on the advisory board and in the clinic. She knew that Blacks would instinctively suspect whites of wanting to decrease their numbers. She would later use this knowledge to implement the Negro Project. Sanger convinced the community so well that Harlem's largest Black church, the Abyssinian Baptist Church, held a mass meeting featuring Sanger as the speaker. So just let that sink in for a minute. Harlem's largest Black church had Margaret Sanger, a eugenicist, founder of Planned Parenthood, whose one of their main missions were to rid the earth of people they deemed not worthy of living, which included Black people, to be a speaker at the church. But that event received criticism. At least one very prominent minister of a denomination other than Baptist spoke out against Sanger. Dr. Adam Clayton Powell Sr., the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist, received adverse criticism from the unnamed minister who was surprised that he'd allow that awful woman in his church. Grace Congregational Church hosted a debate on birth control. Proponents argued birth control was necessary to regulate births in proportion to the family's income. Spacing births would help mothers recover physically and fathers financially. Physically strong and mentally sound babies would result, and incidences of communicable diseases would decrease. Opponents contended that as a minority group, Blacks needed to increase rather than decrease, and that they needed an equal distribution of wealth to improve their status. In the end, the debate judges decided the proponents were more persuasive. Birth control would improve the status of Blacks. Still, there were others who equated birth control with abortion and therefore considered it immoral. Eventually, the Urban League took control of the clinic, an indication the Black community had become ensnared in Sanger's labyrinth. Birth control as a solution. The Harlem Clinic and ensuing birth control debate opened a dialogue among Blacks about how to best improve their disadvantageous position. Some viewed birth control as a viable solution. High reproduction, they believed, meant prolonged poverty and degradation. Let's read that again. Some viewed birth control as a viable solution. High reproduction, insert of Black babies, they believed meant prolonged poverty and degradation. Desperate for change, others began to accept the rationale of birth control. A few embraced eugenics. The June 1932 edition of the Birth Control Review, called The Negro Number, featured a series of articles written by Blacks on the virtues of birth control. The editorial posed this question: shall they go in for quantity or quality in children? Shall they bring children into the world to enrich the undertakers, the physicians, and furnish work for social workers and jailers? Or shall they produce children who are going to be an asset to the group and American society? The answer: most Blacks, especially women, would choose quality if they only knew how. Du Bois, in his article, Black Folk and Birth Control, noted the inevitable clash of ideals between those Negroes who were striving to improve their economic position and those whose religious faith made the limitation of children a sin. He criticized the mass of ignorant Negroes who bred carelessly and disastrously, so that the increase among them is from that part of the population least intelligent and fit, and least able to rear their children properly. Du Bois called for a more liberal attitude among Black churches. He said they were open to intelligent propaganda of any sort. Intelligent propaganda. and the American Birth Control League and other agencies ought to get their speakers before church congregations and their arguments in the Negro newspapers. Charles Johnson, Fisk University's first Black president, wrote, "Eugenic discrimination was necessary for Blacks." He said the high maternal and infant mortality rates, along with diseases like tuberculosis, typhoid, malaria, and venereal infection, made it difficult for large families to adequately sustain themselves. Further, the status of Negroes as marginal workers, their confinement to the lowest paid branches of industry, the necessity for the labors of mothers as well as children to balance meager budgets, so there we go, with the necessity for Black women to work. What did we discuss earlier? There was a law. The Black women didn't want to work. They wanted to stay home to care for their children, but we have evidence in one city in Alexandria, Louisiana, that there was an actual law on the books that forced Black women to work, go against their nature, which is to nurture and care for the children. So here we are again back in the 30s talking about that issue. But we'll continue. Further, the status of Negroes as marginal workers, their confinement to the lowest paid branches of industry, the necessity for the labors of mothers as well as children to balance meager budgets are factors that emphasize the need for lessening the burden not only for themselves, but of society, which must provide the supplementary support in the form of relief. Johnson later served on the National Advisory Council to the BCFA, becoming integral to the Negro Project. Writer Walter A. Terpening described bringing a Black child into a hostile world as pathetic. In his article, God's Chillin', he wrote, "The birth of a colored child, even to parents who can give it adequate support, is pathetic in view of the unchristian and undemocratic treatment likely to be accorded it at the hands of a predominantly white community, and the denial of choice in propagation to this unfortunate class is nothing less than barbarous," emphasis added. Tarpening considered birth control for Blacks as the more humane provision and more eugenic than among whites. He felt birth control information should have first been disseminated among Blacks rather than the white upper crust. He failed to look at the problematic attitudes and behavior of society and how they suppressed Blacks. He offered no solutions to the injustice and vile racism that Blacks endured. Sadly, Du Bois' words of Black churches being open to intelligent propaganda proved prophetic. Black pastors invited Sanger to speak to their congregations. Black publications like the Afro-American and the Chicago Defender featured her writings. Rather than attacking root causes of maternal and infant deaths, diseases, poverty, unemployment, and a host of other social ills, not the least of which was racism, anger pushed birth control. To many, it was better for Blacks not to be born rather than endure such a harsh existence. Against this setting, Sanger charmed the Black community's most distinguished leaders into accepting her plan, which was designed to their own detriment. She peddled her wares wrapped in pretty packages labeled better health and family planning. Where have we heard that before? No one could deny the benefits of better health, being financially ready to raise children, or spacing one's children. However, the solution to the real issues affecting Blacks did not lay in reducing their numbers. It lay in attacking the forces in society that hindered their progress. Most importantly, one had to discern Sanger's motive behind her push for birth control in the community. It was not an altruistic one. Web of deceit. And I apologize, the article is actually, it's pretty long. I'm not gonna continue reading the whole thing. I think you get the point. Lots of people from many, many years ago came together to form an unholy alliance to normalize the killing of babies in the womb through abortion. And Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood, and it was her mission to reduce the numbers of Black babies. So I read the article before, so I'm just kind of scrolling down to close out. So this goes on to talk about the history of additional clinics that popped up around the country in largely Black communities. And this part was interesting to me as well. A report indicated that contrary to expectations, the lives of Black patients serviced by the clinics did not improve dramatically from birth control. Insert abortion when you hear birth control. Two beliefs stood in the way. Some Blacks likened birth control to abortion, and others regarded it as inherently immoral. However, when thrown against the total pictures of the awareness on the part of Negro leaders of the improved conditions and their opportunities to even better conditions under Planned Parenthood, the obstacles to the program are greatly outweighed. So, again, the article just kind of goes on to give further evidence of how the alliance between a eugenicist, which is Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, got together with prominent Black leaders of the day and the churches to push the idea that it was better to kill the babies than to possibly have them grow up in poverty. And it was agreed to push the idea first among Black people before the white upper crust, as we read earlier in the article. So again, keep that in mind in light of Kendra's excellent video that she posted the other day. So now let's move on to the labor market. So we read the article again earlier that Erica posted about Black women being forced to work. We just saw how Margaret Sanger tied in economic prosperity into the idea of not having Black babies, and how those two have been intertwined since the beginning of the abortion movement. So this article kind of goes on to discuss further what we read in that newspaper article that had been posted in the Alexandria, Louisiana newspaper. So this article was published in February of 2019, and this is from Working Economics blog on the Economic Policy Institute website, which is epi.org. You can find that and read it for yourself. And I'm not going to read this whole article, but I do want to read a little bit of it because, again, it gives context to how we got to where we are today, which I believe that we've been programmed to not think of ourselves as important enough or worthy to be married and procreate, which is normal and natural for human beings. So the article begins, Black women's labor market history reveals deep-seated race and gender discrimination. The Black woman's experience in America provides arguably the most overwhelming evidence of the persistent and ongoing drag from gender and race discrimination on the economic fate of workers and families. Let's go down now to African American women's unique labor market history and current occupational status reflects certain beliefs and practices. I'm paraphrasing there. Compared with other women in the United States, Black women have always had the highest levels of labor market participation, regardless of age, marital status, or presence of children at home. In 1880, 35.4% of married Black women and 73% 73.3% of single Black women were in the labor force, compared with only 7.3% of married white women and 23.8% of single white women. Let that sink in. 1880, 35% of married Black women worked, compared to 7. That's almost 5 times the rate of labor participation. And as we saw, it appears to be they were forced to work because they needed to provide care for society's upper crust, the children of the society's upper crust. They're forced to provide domestic work. Black women's higher participation rates extended over their lifetimes, even after marriage, while white women typically left the labor force after marriage. Kendra touched on that as well, Crimson Cure channel. Differences in Black and white women's labor participation were due not only to the societal expectation of Black women's gainful employment, but also to labor market discrimination against Black men, which resulted in lower wages and less stable employment compared to white men. Consequently, married Black women have a long history of being financial contributors, even co-breadwinners to two-parent households, because of Black men's precarious labor market position. Black women's main jobs historically have been in low-wage agriculture and domestic service. Even after migration to the North during the 20th century, most employers would only hire Black women in domestic service work. Revealingly, although whites have devalued Black women as mothers to their own children, Black women have been the most likely of all women to be employed in the low-wage women's jobs that involve cooking, cleaning, and caregiving, even though this work is associated with mothering more broadly. So let that sink in. It says, although whites have devalued Black women as mothers to their own children, their skills were seen to be important enough to mother other people's children as domestics. Until the 1970s, employers' exclusion of Black women from better paying, higher status jobs with mobility meant that they had little choice but to perform private domestic service work for white families. The 1970s was also the era when large numbers of married white women began to enter into the labor force, and this led to a marketization of services previously performed within the household, including care and food services. Black women continue to be overrepresented in service jobs. Nearly a third, 28% of Black women are employed in service jobs, compared to just 1/5 of white women. And again, this article was published in 2019, February. So a little under 3 years ago. I'm 53 years old. I'll be 54 in a short time. So this is talking about during my lifetime now, about the exclusion of Black women from better paying jobs with mobility. Let's continue a little bit. Discriminatory public policies have reinforced the view of Black women as workers rather than as mothers, and contributed to Black women's economic precarity. This has been most evident with protective welfare policies that enabled poor, lone white mothers to stay at home and provide care for their children since the early 20th century. I found it interesting that the writer used the word lone rather than single. So let's reread that and replace the word lone, which is another way of saying single. Because even in the writing of the article, they still try to make single motherhood among white women to be less of a bad thing than among Black women. So let's reread that and replace lone with single. This has been most evident with protective welfare policies that enabled poor single white mothers there to stay at home and provide care for their children since the early 20th century. These policies were first implemented at the state level with mothers' pensions, and then at the national level with the passage of the Social Security Act of 1935. Up until the 1960s, caseworkers excluded most poor Black women from receiving cash assistance because they expected Black women to be employed moms and not stay at home moms like white women. So, question, if they were expected to work, who would watch their children? Let's continue. This exclusion meant that for most of the history of welfare, the state actively undermined the well-being of Black families by ensuring that Black women would be in the labor force as low-wage caregivers for white families. This helped to secure the well-being of white families and alleviated white women of having to do this work. The state simultaneously undermined the well-being of Black families by denying Black mothers the cash assistance that they needed to support their children and leaving Black women with no other option but to work for very low wages. Indeed, the backlash against poor Black moms receiving cash assistance eventually culminated in the dismantling of the AFDC program and the enactment of TANF, a program with strict work requirements. Because of discriminatory employer and government policies against Black women, Black men and women, Black mothers with school-aged children have always been more likely to be in the labor force compared with other moms. Today, 78% of Black moms with children are employed, compared with an average of just 66% of white, Asian, American, and Latin moms. And then it goes on to talk about how Black women have a lower median income. And this part was also very interesting. Black families are more reliant on women's incomes than other families, since 80% of Black mothers are breadwinners in their families. So that's pretty much the gist of the article. So let's recap where we are. Again, starting with Kendra's excellent discussion of the lost cause doctrine, the retelling of history to make the losers the victors. We then have the introduction of eugenics and abortion into American culture, pushed by Black leaders and Black churches. We then have employers or governments forcing Black women to work, as we saw in the article from the 20s or 30s. If somebody knows the year that was actually published, I would appreciate if you could please note it in the comments. Actually, I saw that article that I posted earlier on Instagram, and I can't find it now. But the person who originally posted the whole article did cite the year that that the article was posted, because she got it out of her grandmother's belongings. Anyway, so, and then one last point, and I didn't want this video to be so long, but I think it's important to understand how we got to where we are today, and again, to think more deeply about these topics. So we read earlier that one of the reasons that Black women were forced to work was because of the discrimination faced by Black men. So then let's move to one other incident, or two other things, and then I will end it, that ties into this. This is, hopefully you've heard about the Tuskegee Experiment. This article is from McGill.ca website, Office for Science and Society, and published also in 2019, the 25th of January to be exact, almost 3 years ago. 40 Years of Human Experimentation in America, the Tuskegee Experiment. Starting in 1932, 600 African American men from Macon County, Alabama, were enlisted to partake in a scientific experiment on syphilis. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was conducted in the United States Public Health Service and involved blood tests, x-rays, spinal taps, and autopsies of the subjects. By the way, I believe this publication is Canadian. That's where the .ca comes from. Let's continue. The goal was to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis in Black populations, but the subjects were unaware of this and were simply told they were receiving treatment for bad blood. Actually, they received no treatment at all. Even after penicillin was discovered as a safe and reliable cure for syphilis, the majority of the men did not receive it. To really understand the heinous nature of the Tuskegee experiment requires some societal context, a lot of history, and a realization of just how many times government agencies were given a chance to stop this human experimentation but didn't. In 1865, the ratification of the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution formally ended the enslavement of Black Americans. But by the early 20th century, the cultural and medical landscape of the U.S. was still built upon and inundated with racist concepts. Social Darwinism, was rising, predicated on the survival of the fittest and scientific racism, a pseudo-scientific practice of using science to reinforce racial biases was common. Many white people already thought themselves superior to Blacks, and science and medicine was all too happy to reinforce this hierarchy. Before the ending of slavery, scientific racism was used to justify the African slave trade. Scientists argued that African men were uniquely fit for enslavement due to their physical strength and simple minds. They argued that slaves possessed primitive nervous systems, so did not experience pain as white people did. Enslaved African Americans in the South were claimed to suffer from mental illness at rates lower than their free Northern counterparts, thereby proving that enslavement was good for them. And slaves who ran away were said to be suffering from their own mental illness known as drapetomania. During and after the American Civil War, African Americans were argued to be a different species from white Americans, and mixed race children were presumed prone to many medical issues. Doctors of the time testified that the emancipation of slaves had caused the mental, moral, and physical deterioration of the Black population. Let's reread that. Doctors at the time testified that the emancipation of slaves had caused the mental, moral, and physical deterioration of the Black population, observing that virtually free of disease as slaves, they were now overwhelmed by it. Many believed that the African Americans were doomed to extinction, and arguments were made about their physiology being unsuited for the colder climates of America. Thus, they should be returned to Africa. Scientific and medical authorities of the late 19th, early 20th centuries held extremely harmful pseudoscientific ideas, specifically about the sex drives and genitals of African Americans. Kendra mentioned, I don't know if it was in that video that I referenced earlier, but we've got the movie Birth of a Nation, which I believe debuted in the early 1900s, that put the Black man, the Negro man, as being scary and basically R-wording everybody. So there's that as well. So that's a cultural influence there. And now we've got science, medical fields, and then we talked about government interaction when we discussed Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger's involvement in that and getting subsidies given to people to have abortions. Let's continue. Scientific and medical authorities of the late 19th, early 20th centuries held extremely harmful pseudoscientific ideas, specifically about the sex drives and genitals of African Americans. It was widely believed that while the brains of African Americans were under-evolved, their genitals were overdeveloped. Black men were seen to have an intrinsic perversion for white women, and all African Americans were seen as inherently immoral with insatiable sexual appetites. This all matters because it was with these understandings of race, sexuality, and health that researchers undertook the Tuskegee study. They believed, largely due to their fundamentally flawed scientific understandings of race, that Black people were extremely prone to sexually transmitted infections like syphilis. Low birth rates and high miscarriage rates were universally blamed on STIs. They also believed that all Black people, regardless of their education, background, economic, or personal situations, could not be convinced to get treatment for syphilis. Thus, the USPHS could justify the Tuskegee study, calling it a study in nature rather than an experiment meant to simply observe the natural progression of syphilis within a community that wouldn't seek treatment. So they purposely gave the men syphilis and didn't treat them. That's the gist of the experiment. In case you didn't know, I don't want to, again, belabor the video, but I just wanted to insert that as another kind of point along this historical timeline that we've traveled down so far. And then the last point I will mention, or 2 points actually, is the 1994 crime bill, which incarcerated large numbers of Black men, as you can research on your own. And then traveling through to today with the media, the entertainment industries, the music that is popularized nowadays, the images that our young men and women see, talking about having children with multiple women, not being married, being promiscuous. We uplift celebrities who have multiple children with people not being married, and we downplay marriage as something that should not be pursued. So, yeah. So what I would like for you to do is your own research into all this information that I've just dumped on you with regards to what I believe has been the programming that has been put upon the Black community over time. Because once you are aware that things are being done to you, you can then have the ability to change the way that you think. Look at the outcomes that you're getting. If you don't like where you are, you have to start doing something that's different. We'll do later videos that talk about the many benefits of marriage and how important it is to society, why it's beneficial for everyone, men and women included, especially the children that are raised inside of a marriage with the mother and father living together in the home. But again, this Kendra's excellent video, again, shout out to Crimson Cure channel. Please, I'll link her the video in the description box. Check out that video. Her video prompted me to do this because I was reading this book again, which kind of tried to paint Margaret Sanger in a more favorable light than what should have been. And then that kind of led me down this road. So I'm going to end the video now, but hopefully you got an understanding of all the many forces that have been coming at us since forever about how we're not worthy to even be parents, how we're not worthy to be married, to have stable homes, how we're seen as workers, workhorses, worker bees, mules, versus human beings with in a traditional family sense, with the husband providing for the home and the wife being able to stay home and care for her children. All these other ideas were placed upon us. You saw in the article, I'll finally leave it with this. You saw in the article that I reposted from Erica Williams's community page. Again, shout out to Classic Climb Blog. That there were actual laws in the books. I'm sure there were other cities. I'm assuming that Louisiana town wasn't the only one, because typically laws didn't have not worked like that. But you saw that women were actually forced to work, or they were fined or run out of town. So again, my question to you is, have we been programmed to believe that marriage and family are bad? And so we then still have the biological aspect, because it is normal for most women. I know that all women don't want children, but it's normal for most women to want to reproduce. And so you have younger women nowadays thinking that I'll just have a baby and I don't need the father in the home. I'll do another video in the future to discuss why that is detrimental. Should be self-explanatory, but it unfortunately is not. And talk more about the importance of marriage and two-parent homes in society at large. So thank you for joining me on this longer than I expected journey down history lane, but I thought it was important to read these articles together and to just, again, get you to think about what's happening, why things are happening. And therefore, when you learn history, you can change things and stop repeating cycles. That was the whole point. So please like, comment, and share the video. Let me know what you think, please. I should say like and share the video, comment on the video below. Let me know what you think about it. Love to have some dialogue about the topic. Thank you so much for watching and listening. And until next time, I will see you later. And let me do this. Thanks again for stopping by our channel, and we'll see you next time. Take care.